Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Before I say anything else, I want to ask you something. And I want you to answer honestly, even if only in your own mind. How many of you have failed at something? A test, a relationship, a job interview, a dream you chased with everything you had and still didn't catch. If you're being truthful, every hand in this room should be raised right now, including mine. Because failure is not rare. It is not reserved for the unlucky, the lazy, or the unprepared. Failure is universal. It is the one experience that every human being on this planet shares, regardless of background, wealth, intelligence, or talent. Kings have failed. Scientists have failed. Champions have failed. Your parents have failed. I have failed, more times than I can count. And yet we treat failure like a disease. We hide it. We're ashamed of it. We whisper about our failures instead of speaking about them out loud. We build entire identities around the fear of it, spending more energy avoiding failure than we spend pursuing success. Today, I want to change that conversation. I want to stand here and tell you something that took me years to understand, something I wish someone had told me when I was much younger, sitting exactly where some of you might be sitting right now. Heart still sore from a setback you haven't told anyone about. Here it is. Failure is not the end. It is not a verdict on your worth, your intelligence, or your future. Failure is a new beginning. It is data. It is fuel. It is, in more cases than we ever give it credit for, the single greatest teacher you will ever have. By the end of this talk, I hope you will walk away seeing your failures, past, present, and future, in a completely different light, not as scars to hide, but as chapters to be proud of. I'm not going to promise you that failure feels good. It doesn't. And I won't stand here and pretend otherwise. What I am going to promise you is that failure, looked at honestly and handled well, is almost never wasted. Every failure you have ever experienced is still doing something for you right now, even if you can't yet see what that something is. Let's begin. Part 1, the fear we all carry. To understand why failure feels so heavy, we first need to understand where that fear comes from. It didn't arrive out of nowhere. We were taught it. From the moment we start school, we are graded. Right answers are rewarded with praise, gold stars, high marks, and proud smiles from teachers and parents. Wrong answers are circled in red ink, corrected in front of the class, sometimes even laughed at by classmates who were simply relieved it wasn't them. We learn very early that being wrong is bad and being right is good. There is rarely room in that system for the idea that I tried something bold and it didn't work, might be just as valuable as getting the answer right the first time. This conditioning doesn't end when we leave the classroom. It follows us into our careers, where performance reviews focus on results, not on the courage it took to attempt something difficult. It follows us into our relationships, where we feel we're expected to always say the right thing, make the right choice, love the right person at the right time. It follows us onto our phones, where social media shows us everyone else's highlight reel, the promotion, the vacation, the engagement photo, and makes it seem like success comes easily to everyone except us. So slowly, without ever choosing to, many of us develop something psychologists call a fear of failure. And this is more than simply disliking the feeling of losing. It becomes a fear that failure defines us. That one failed exam means we are not smart. That one failed relationship means we are not lovable. That one failed business means we are not capable. That one failed audition means we were never talented to begin with. This kind of thinking has a name. Psychologist Carol Dweck calls it a fixed mindset. The belief that our abilities and our worth are static, unchangeable, decided once and for all. In a fixed mindset, failure feels catastrophic because it seems to prove that you never had it in the first place. One bad grade becomes proof that you're bad at the subject forever. One rejection becomes proof that you'll always be rejected. But there is another way to see the world. Dweck calls it the growth mindset. The belief that abilities are not fixed but built, the same way a muscle is built through use and resistance. In a growth mindset, failure is not proof of inadequacy. It is proof that you are standing at the very edge of your current ability, reaching for something just beyond it. It hurts because you're stretching, and stretching is exactly how growth happens. Here is the truth I want you to take from this section, more than any other. The people who go on to do extraordinary things in this world are almost never the people who never fail. They are the people who fail just as often, sometimes more, and simply interpret it differently than everyone around them. That difference in interpretation is not a personality trait some people are born with and others are not. It is a skill, and skills can be learned. Part 2, redefining failure. Let's redefine failure together, right now, in this room, so that when you walk out of here, the word carries a different weight than it did when you walked in. Failure is not, I am not good enough. Failure is, I am not there yet. Failure is not, this is who I am. Failure is, this is what happened, one time, under one set of conditions. Failure is not a mirror reflecting your identity back at you. Failure is a signpost pointing you toward a better road. Think about how a scientist views a failed experiment. A real scientist does not crumple up their notes in shame and abandon their field forever. They record the result, they adjust one variable, they try again. Thomas Edison, whose story I'll return to shortly, did exactly this. Not once or twice, but thousands of times, with a patience that most of us would find unimaginable. Now think about something even more familiar. How a toddler learns to walk. A toddler falls down. Not once, not twice, but dozens, sometimes hundreds of times in the space of just a few weeks. But a toddler never once looks up at their parents from the floor and says, I suppose walking just isn't for me. They get up, they try again, not because they are unusually brave, but because they haven't yet learned to attach shame to falling. That shame is something we learn later in life. And here is the good news. Anything we learn, we can also unlearn. I want you to imagine for a moment that failure is not a locked door, but a hallway. A hallway with many doors along it. Some of those doors don't open. You push and nothing happens. And you have to admit that this particular door isn't the one. But the hallway itself keeps going. There is always another door. The only way to truly fail, in the deepest sense of that word, is to sit down in the hallway and refuse to walk any further. Part 3, 10 stories the world remembers. Let me tell you about people whose failures history now treats as legendary. Not because they never failed, but because of what they chose to do afterward. Thomas Edison. When Thomas Edison set out to invent a functional, long-lasting light bulb, he tested thousands of different materials for the filament. Different metals, different fibers, different combinations of both, and the overwhelming majority of them failed. When a reporter once asked him how it felt to fail so many times, Edison is widely remembered as saying that he hadn't failed at all. He had simply discovered thousands of materials that didn't work, and each discovery brought him one step closer to the one that would. Eventually, he found it, and the modern electric light bulb was born, quite literally illuminating the world we now live in. Imagine for a moment if he had quit at attempt number 500 or 5,000. The room you are sitting in right now might look very different. Michael Jordan, considered by many to be the greatest basketball player who has ever lived, was cut from his high school varsity basketball team as a sophomore. He went home that day and cried in his room, humiliated in front of friends who had made the team when he hadn't. But instead of walking away from the sport, he used that rejection as fuel. He woke up earlier than his teammates. He stayed on the court later than anyone else. He refused to let one coach's decision on one afternoon define the rest of his life. He went on to win 6 NBA championships and become one of the most recognized athletes on the planet. Jordan has spoken openly many times about how his failures, the missed shots, the lost games, that early rejection shaped him far more deeply than his victories ever did. J.K. Rowling. Before Harry Potter became one of the best-selling book series in human history, J.K. Rowling faced rejection after rejection from publisher after publisher. At the time, she was a single mother, living on public assistance, writing in cafes because she couldn't always afford to heat her own flat. 12 different publishing houses turned down her manuscript. 12. Try to imagine hearing the word no 12 separate times about something you poured your entire heart into. She kept submitting it anyway, until finally one small publisher decided to take a chance on an unknown author's strange story about a boy wizard. Today, that series has sold hundreds of millions of copies and has been translated into dozens of languages around the world. Walt Disney. Walt Disney was fired from an early newspaper job because his editor felt he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. Sit with that for a moment. A man who would go on to redefine imagination itself for generations of children across the entire world was told in writing that he had none. He also lived through the bankruptcy of one of his earliest animation studios, watching an early dream collapse completely. But he kept building. He kept creating. And eventually, he built an empire of storytelling that continues to shape childhoods on every continent decades after his death. Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey was demoted from her early job as a television news anchor because she was told she was simply not suited for the medium. She was also let go from a reporting position for becoming too emotionally invested in the stories she covered, the very quality that would later become her greatest strength. Rather than treating this as the end of her career, she pivoted toward a more personal, conversational format that let her authentic, emotionally present style shine through fully. That pivot made her one of the most influential media figures of the modern era. Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs co-founded Apple in a garage, built it into a major company, and then, at the age of 30, was pushed out of the very company he had helped create by a board he had personally helped select. He has described this period of his life as devastating, being publicly removed, in his own words, from the company that had become his life's work. But years later, he said that being fired from Apple turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to him, because it freed him to enter one of the most creative and experimental periods of his career, a period that eventually brought him back to Apple and helped him lead it to create some of the most influential technology products the world has ever seen. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, remembered today as one of history's most respected leaders, endured a long list of failures before ever reaching the presidency. Failed business ventures, lost elections, the loss of loved ones, and periods of deep personal despair. He ran for various political offices multiple times throughout his life and lost more often than he won. And yet, he persisted. Election after election, setback after setback, until he became one of the most consequential leaders his nation has ever known. Colonel Harlan Sanders, the man behind the world-famous fried chicken recipe of KFC, did not find success until he was in his 60s. Before that recipe made him famous, he moved from failed venture to failed venture, a failed farm, a failed legal practice, a failed service station business. As the story is widely told, he took his chicken recipe to well over 1,000 restaurants, hearing rejection after rejection before a single one finally agreed to try it. From that one yes, after a lifetime of no, he built a global fast food empire that still bears his image today. Stephen King. Stephen King, now one of the best-selling authors in the world, had his early writing rejected by publishers so many times that he kept a spike nailed to his bedroom wall simply to hold all the rejection letters he accumulated. At one especially low point, he threw an early draft of what would become his novel Carrie into the trash, convinced it simply wasn't good enough to continue. It was his wife who retrieved the pages from the bin and encouraged him to keep going. That novel went on to launch his career and helped make him a household name in fiction for the decades that followed. The Wright Brothers. Before Orville and Wilbur Wright achieved the first successful flight of a powered aircraft, they built and tested glider after glider, many of which crashed, sometimes dangerously. They faced open ridicule from newspapers and deep skepticism from the scientific establishment of their time, many of whom considered heavier than air flight to be effectively impossible for a human being to achieve. They pushed forward anyway through failed test after failed test until, on a windy December morning in 1903, they achieved the first sustained, controlled flight in human history, forever changing how our entire species would move through the world. Henry Ford. Before Henry Ford's name became synonymous with the modern automobile, he founded not one but two car companies that failed completely. The first, the Detroit Automobile Company, folded within 2 years. The second collapsed after bitter disagreements over the company's direction, leaving Ford without a business for the second time in the same industry. Most people, having failed twice in exactly the same field, would have taken that as a clear signal to try something else with their life entirely. Ford took it as information instead. He studied precisely what had gone wrong in both failed ventures: poor quality control, disagreements over affordable versus luxury vehicles, and applied those specific, hard-won lessons to a third attempt, the Ford Motor Company, which went on to revolutionize manufacturing itself through the moving assembly line and put automobiles within reach of ordinary families for the first time in human history. Sara Blakely, founder of the shapewear brand Spanx, grew up with a father who asked her and her brother one question at the dinner table every single week. Not, "What did you achieve this week?" but "What did you fail at this week?" If they had no failure to report, he expressed genuine disappointment, not because he wanted them to struggle, but because he wanted them to understand that attempting difficult things and sometimes failing at them was the entire point of a life worth living. Blakely carried that lesson into adulthood. Before Spanx became a billion-dollar company, she personally pitched her idea to manufacturer after manufacturer, absorbing rejection after rejection, often from people who didn't understand the product or didn't take a young, unknown female inventor seriously. She kept going anyway, eventually found one manufacturer willing to take a chance, and built one of the most recognizable clothing brands in the world, crediting her father's dinner table question to this day as the reason she was never afraid to fail in the first place. What connects every single one of these stories? None of these people are remembered today for their failures. They are remembered for what came after, for the choice made quietly, privately, without applause, often in the middle of grief or humiliation, to keep going anyway. Part 4, the science of bouncing back. There is real science behind why failure, when it is processed the right way, makes us stronger rather than weaker. Researchers who study learning and the brain have found that when we make mistakes and then take time to genuinely reflect on them, our brains show increased activity in the very regions associated with learning and memory formation. In simple terms, failure, followed by honest reflection, creates the ideal conditions for growth. Your brain quite literally begins rewiring itself to perform better the next time you attempt the same task. Psychologists have also studied something called post-traumatic growth. The well-documented finding that people who move through significant hardship, including major failures and losses, very often emerge from that hardship with a deeper sense of purpose, stronger relationships, and greater personal resilience than they had before the hardship occurred. Not because the hardship itself was good, it rarely feels good in the moment, but because of the way they chose, consciously or not, to respond to it. This tells us something important. Resilience is not something you either have or don't have, handed out at birth in fixed quantities to the lucky few. Resilience is a skill. And like every other skill worth having, it is built through repeated practice. Specifically, the practice of facing a setback, feeling its full weight, and getting back up anyway. Athletes understand this instinctively, often better than anyone else. A boxer is not trained by only ever landing punches. They are trained by absorbing hits and learning how to stay standing afterward. A weightlifter does not build muscle by lifting weights that feel easy and comfortable. Growth happens specifically through resistance, through strain, through the moment when a muscle fiber is pushed right to its limit, slightly torn down, and then rebuilt stronger than it was before. Failure works on our character in almost exactly the same way. It is resistance training for the soul. It is uncomfortable by design, And that discomfort is precisely the mechanism by which strength is built. Part 5, failure close to home. Let's bring all of this closer to home. Let's talk about failure in the actual places where you live your actual life. Not just in history books, but in classrooms, offices, homes, and stadiums. In education. Perhaps you are a student in this room right now and you have failed an exam, a class, or even an entire year. It can feel like the world is ending, like your entire future has been decided in one sitting, under fluorescent lights, staring down at a paper covered in red marks and a grade that feels like a life sentence. But a grade is a snapshot, not a sentence. It tells you where you stood on one specific day, in one specific subject, under one specific set of conditions. It does not tell you who you are, and it certainly does not tell you who you will become. Some of the most accomplished people in history struggled academically at various points in their lives in ways that rarely make it into the highlight reel of their biography. What matters far more than the grade itself is what you do the day after. Do you quietly give up on the subject forever, or do you ask for help, adjust how you study, and try again with new information?